Okay, let's get started on our very last theoretical framework, feminist family theory. So pause for a minute and think about your immediate reactions to the word feminist. Do you have more positive words like equality and empowered, or do you have more kind of neutral words like women's rights, or more negative words like radical or man-hater or bra burning or and so my point in kind of doing this activity is that even though feminism is still controversial in our society, people have different reactions to that word. Within the field of family studies, it's not really considered controversial anymore. It was when it came about in the 80s and maybe the early 90s, but now it's just an accepted lens through which to view families. So let's just review some of the waves of feminism. So the first wave from mid-1800s until 1920 was basically about the suffrage movement, women's right to vote. And oh yeah, it took 75 years for women to get the right to vote. That involved leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The second wave was about the women's liberation movement in conjunction with the civil rights movement. This was some writings of Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, involved the Equal Pay Act, the birth control pill, legalized abortion. And this was also a time when the women's movement was getting criticized for being a white women's movement specifically, and we saw a womanist movement emerging for Black women who felt excluded, for example, by the feminist movement. So the feminist movement tried to address this in its third wave of feminism from the 1990s to currently, which was really spurred a lot by Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, looking at power and privilege across social identities, not just within gender, and taking into account kind of multiple social identities, and also began to involve queer theory. There is a fourth wave of feminism, but I don't quite grasp it as a distinct stage, and some say it's just a continuation of the third, so I haven't included that here, but you might learn about that elsewhere. As we go over these assumptions of feminist family theory, you'll hear that they seem to be a little bit more first and second wave feminism focused. I think some of the upcoming concepts are more reflective of third wave feminism. So the first one, gender structures all societies. So we as humans, we like categories, helps us make sense of the world. And so even though we are allowing gender to be more fluid in the past, we still want to know what the identity is. It's the first question we ask when someone says they're having a baby or they're pregnant. Is it a boy or a girl? And we can see this in our current social issues around transgender bathroom politics, which bathrooms you're allowed to use, or using our pronouns, right? So we like to be clear. These next two assumptions are that kind of go together. In general, women have had less power historically, and that the family, while wonderful, often perpetuates this inequality. So, for example, in a heterosexual family in which the husband works full-time and the woman works part-time and provides more of the child care, if that couple is to divorce, men's income continues to rise with their worker status, yet the woman's income tends to decline because we don't really place a value on care work or tie any money to that. And so the family has intentionally or unintentionally often replicated women's kind of lack of power. Other assumptions about feminism are that it's emancipatory. This just means that feminism emphasizes social change. The other theories we study simply try to describe families, but feminist family theory tries to describe, but then also say we are working towards the ideal of equality. And then the last one is the family is not monolithic. It's just simply a way of saying that there are varying forms of the family. Not all families are the SNAF. Okay, so feminism came into the field of family studies from other places, and there's lots of intellectual traditions, and I'll just highlight a few. The first two, Mary Wollstonecraft and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, those are more first wave feminism. Margaret Mead, Betty Friedan, probably more second wave feminism. So Mary Wollstonecraft was writing around the end of the 1700s, and she was pointing out that women are failing to develop their minds because their only avenue of power was through marriage. They didn't have kind of education and career opportunities, and she was suggesting that if they had, they could actually, rival men. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was writing about 100 years later, and she had this interesting proposal that basically in order to give value to women's work, like cooking, nutrition, childcare, cleaning, that these should be paid professions at the community or neighborhood level. So one woman could cook for lots of families, one woman could clean for lots of families, one woman could provide the childcare, and that way we could kind of elevate women's work and assign kind of money to it, essentially. You may remember Charlotte Perkins Gilman from this yellow wallpaper short story in your American literature class. I read it, and it sounds like it's still being used in some schools. This, if you recall, is about a woman who experienced postpartum depression, and her husband, who was a doctor, required total bed rest, and eventually she went insane, crawling around the edges of her room looking at the yellow wallpaper. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, just interestingly, also wrote this novel, Herland, which I read many years ago, which was a female utopia in which no men existed. So there's some of that male bashing that feminism gets its reputation for. The anthropologist Margaret Mead, interestingly, she was married to Gregory Bateson, the father of family system, one of the fathers of family systems theory. But she was studying cultures in which the gendered behaviors were reversed, where the women were more aggressive and the men were more nurturing. And she was arguing that gendered behaviors aren't so much about genetics or biology, but more about culture. And that kind of will tie into some liberal feminism that we're going to see coming in this lecture. And then Betty Friedan wrote in the 1960s, the very famous The Feminine Mystique. She was really challenging this idea that the nuclear family in the suburbs was the American dream, was psychological fulfilling. And in fact, she coined the phrase, the problem with no name, which was the high rates of anxiety and depression that women were experiencing in the 1950s, which we're going to hear more about when we get to historical context. And she also coined the term mother's little helper to refer to Valium, which when women were taking in higher rates during the 1950s to try to kind of get through their tedious lives. Okay, so I think you probably have heard, but feminist theory distinguishes between sex, which is your biology, and gender or gender roles, which is your identity or the meaning, attitudes, and behaviors. And then feminist family theory would also say that gender roles are created in this reciprocal or interactional process between the individual and society, also called the institution. So if you think about the father role and how that's changed over time, 20 years ago, my friends who were pushing strollers were stopped and complimented for being amazing dads. We don't see that quite so much anymore, as more individual dads have taken on the daily tasks of caring for kids. Now we've changed how we portray fatherhood in media, or how we talk about it at the societal or institutional level, which then changes what men do at the individual level. And it's hard to know where it all starts, right? But it's this reciprocal process of evolving gendered roles. Sexism is basically when we are thinking, making kind of potentially harmful attributions about all men or all women. Even if we say something that seems kind of positive, like, oh, women are just so much more nurturing. Well, what about the women who aren't? That could potentially put kind of this expectation on them that's unrealistic. Or sometimes I think of it a lot when we hear funny things like men are pigs, that's a sexist statement, obviously, or I'm giving up on all men, that kind of thing that we hear in movies or as jokes. That's sexist, where we're grouping all men as the same thing and then kind of writing them off. Power and privilege are key constructs. So the first and second waves of feminism were really focusing on power and privilege for white women, where the third wave focused on power and privilege based on multiple social identities. And that ties into this idea of intersectionality, which you can see represented on the slide, of how a variety of potentially minoritized, marginalized identities can intersect in varying ways to create additional challenges. So we can't just be looking at the plight of women, but we have to be thinking about women who are disabled, or women who are gay, or women who are Jewish, or women of color. And then the last concepts on this slide are family, household, and care work. And so basically, this type of household labor, care work, are undervalued in our society. It's underpaid. And many of you know that if you're an HDFS major, right, that the pay for taking care of people tends to be much less than taking care of things, even though I would argue that taking care of kids and older adults, for example, has huge implications, potentially kind of life-altering implications, and yet we really don't pay very much for that. Feminist family theory also highlights and deconstructs the ideology of separate spheres. You can see there's been lots of books written on the separate spheres. Separate spheres means public, meaning the world of work, and private, meaning the world of the home, and that men belong more in the public sphere and women belong more in the private sphere, or have primary responsibility for. The separate spheres ideology emerged with the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, we didn't have as much of a sense that women belonged at home, men belonged outside of the home. But with the Industrial Revolution, we had factories and roads and railways being built. We weren't agrarian or farming anymore. And so some people had to go to work in factories and some people had to stay at home. And this really created this ideology that it should be men leaving the home, going into the public sphere, and women staying at home in the private sphere. And it also led to this idea that men should be able to earn a family wage to support their entire family. It's important to know that that was really only obtainable for, middle to upper middle class families. But it also did become more attainable in the early and mid 1900s, even for working class families, that the man should earn a family wage. In fact, the Ford plant had a whole program, the family wage, that their workers could earn enough to support their entire family. But anyway, we still, to some extent, operate on this separate spheres ideology. It can be kind of in the back of our minds, this kind of hidden, implicit guide that we expect that men, especially men who are fathers, are more likely to be ideal workers, and women should have more primary responsibility for the house and the kids. We kind of might look to her when things aren't going well. In fact, during the transition to parenthood, working men get more of like a boost in how they're perceived at work. They're like, wow, you're a dad now, you must be a real ideal worker. But a woman who has a baby is now like, are you going to be serious about your job? Or are you going to be mommy tracked? Are you going to be distracted? The interesting thing about this separate spheres ideology is it also just even applies to not just heterosexual couples, but same-sex couples also report kind of having to choose between these public and private spheres. Is one of us going to do more of the paid labor and one of us is going to do more of the stay-at-home labor, or is it going to be like one of us doing more of the masculine tasks, one of us doing more of the feminine tasks? So the separate spheres ideology is a challenging one to change. Okay, so now we're going to talk about two forms of feminism, liberal feminism on this side and cultural feminism on the next slide. And this, I think one of the values of talking about this is it helps us understand that even if we might identify as a feminist, you might agree with some feminist statements and not agree with other feminist statements because there's different camps or branches. So this version of feminism, liberal feminism, and gender theory, which is its outgrowth, I'm going to lump them together because they're so similar. And you might search for gender theory if you're interested in doing your theory paper on this. But this version of feminism minimizes the innate or biological differences between sexes, sees males and females as more similar, and gender difference as socially constructed. That basically we come up with these like men are this and women are like this, and then we look for ways that kind of confirm that. I remember that when Isaac was a little and he was loving to kind of play to roughhouse. And I remember my aunt saying, looking at him and saying, he's all boy, but really he also loved pink, and he was, kind of sweet too. And, there were ways that he wasn't all boy, but she was expecting to see that and kind of putting him in that box. And so West and Zimmerman in the 1980s, to get at this kind of social construction and reinforcement of gender, talked about how we do gender. And so you might be thinking, like, how are you doing gender and undoing gender? I had a student tell me that she had an assignment for another class where she had to do something. She had to go out into the world and do something that was not typical for her gender and see how that felt. And so she went to the gym and lifted weights and grunted really loudly, right? And so she was undoing gender, and it felt pretty uncomfortable. And people kind of gave her some odd looks, like, wow, this is unusual. And so, yeah, the way we dress, the way we behave, the way as parents we feel like we might have to care for kids. I remember when my kids were sick, I would feel like, okay, I've got to be a good mother. Like, what would a good mother do here? That's all about doing gender. Let's see. Liberal feminism would also say that we can separate the meaning or attitudes we make about our gendered roles from our behaviors. And so, for example, maybe I'm a man who believes that I should be the breadwinner, but I got laid off, or my wife is making more money than me. What research would say is when we have incongruence, like at the individual level, like I think I should be this, but I'm not, that can create stress. Or if we have disagreement within a couple, like they both think that they're breadwinners, but only he thinks he is, that can create distress. But what we also know is that it's actually our current situation affects our behavior is more affected by our current situation than our kind of gendered beliefs. And so, yeah, maybe I think that I should be the breadwinner, but my wife is in a position where she can just earn a lot more money than me at what she's doing right now. And so I'm going to go ahead and stay home with the kids because that's about my current situation. And interestingly, because our gender constructions are dynamic, that last bullet, if I end up staying home with my kids as a man, maybe I actually start to change my view of my gendered role. Or similarly, a woman who didn't think of herself as the breadwinner, once she starts earning more money, the actual situation is and her behavior is going to actually change her attitude. This is kind of the reverse of how we originally started thinking about sex roles. We originally thought that you grew up with a sense of your sex role as more masculine or more feminine, and then you continued to enact that in kind of a static way throughout your life, whereas now we know people can really shift and change their gendered roles over time. So another example of the differences between meaning and versus behavior is that in heterosexual couples, wives are still spending more time on household labor, but wives' satisfaction or the meaning that they make about household labor is a stronger predictor of their marital well-being than the actual division of labor. So it's again that idea that perception or meaning matters more than reality or objective behaviors. So cultural feminism is in contrast to liberal feminism, and it really emphasizes differences between genders. And it's often called essentialism or essential feminism, thinking about kind of what might be essential female traits associated with your biology, like being more peaceful, being more nurturing, being more emotional, being more expressive. And we see lots of kind of research in this vein, all the brain research that, like women's brains are better at multitasking, right? That's kind of in the cultural feminist tradition. And cultural feminists would say it's not our differences that are the problem. It's instead that we have tended to value traditionally masculine traits like being strong and brave more than being nurturing and caring, or that we've valued intellect over emotion. And what we really need to do is give equal value to these male and female traits. And so cultural feminism also does lead into kind of special treatment for women based on their different safety concerns, physical abilities, physiological differences, with periods and breastfeeding and menopause. So you can see the value in the cultural feminist perspective as well. So what do we do about this? We've got liberal feminism focusing on similarities and cultural feminism focusing on differences. How do we balance it? And so Rachel Hare Mustin really contributed to this. She's here in this picture on the left with a former professor of mine, and I was able to interview Rachel Hare Mustin for a project when I was in graduate school. She's a retired psychologist, and she developed this very famous concept of alpha and beta bias, which has been used to describe gender, and it's also been translated to sexual orientation and race and ethnicity, and we'll get to that eventually. So she came up with these terms, alpha and beta bias, from the errors that we can make in hypothesis testing, alpha error and beta error, which you may have learned about in a stats or research methods class. So alpha error is the likelihood or the probability that you will say there is a difference, a statistically significant difference between these two populations when there's actually not. So you're always trying to go, like less than 0.05, right, is your error. And then beta error is the likelihood that you will actually report, no, there's no statistically significant difference between these populations when in fact one does exist. So how this translates to gender is that alpha bias is about exaggerating differences between males and females that don't actually exist, and that can be kind of like confirmation bias. I expect women to be more emotionally expressive, so I noticed that, and I don't really see the women who aren't emotionally expressive. Beta bias is about ignoring differences between males and females, and these might be differences due to power or privilege, like ignoring women's kind of safety issues or concerns, or it might be assuming that if we do all of our research on young males, that translates to young females. Anything about males kind of translates to female physiology. So I think what these two biases help us understand is that we are trying to be aware of the potential to go in one direction or another and try to avoid either extreme. So I'd encourage you to pause and think about where you stand in terms of gender difference and gender similarity. How do you see the world when you think about boys and girls, men and women, or cisgender, non-binary? Like, how do you conceptualize it? And so some people are thinking more like biological or innate gender differences. Some people are thinking, no, these are more socially constructed, and tend to think that we're more similar. And I want to also point out that you can move on this continuum over the course of your life. I've at one time been very extreme, probably in the E, for emphasizing gender similarities. But then after watching my kids and seeing some patterns, I've maybe moved a little bit more back to the center. And so you might move around during your life as well. The media focuses a lot more on gender difference than gender similarity. Gender difference is just so much more interesting. We see headlines like boys and girls different on math scores, but we don't see, surprise, boys and girls are really the same on math scores. I just clipped some of the kind of research-based headlines that emerge, of differences, and all of these are so interesting. Makes you want to click on each one. Do men really take longer to poo? So fascinating, right? I want to know. So difference is almost inherently more interesting to us than similarity, but that means they get exaggerated, and researchers are not immune to this either. I mean, all of these headlines were research-based because researchers were really selling their research as a gender difference. In fact, so many researchers have gone looking for gender differences, and maybe they find them and then they publish the results. But if they don't find them, they don't even write it up or even talk about that as interesting, because they're actually just disappointed that they didn't find difference. So gender similarity really gets underreported. In fact, if you do a PsycInfo search for gender plus something related to difference or gender plus something related to similarity, you can see that you get, what is that, like 5 times, or more the number of hits for gender difference than you do for gender similarity. And I've read a lot of textbooks, child development textbooks, and I noticed that they often have a section under, toddlerhood that says gender differences, but it doesn't say gender differences and similarities, and it doesn't say something like, most of the things we've talked about in this chapter are similar for boys and girls, but here's a few differences. So again, we seem to be really drawn to difference, which just means we run the risk of alpha bias, essentially. And also we have to remember that when we do see these headlines about gender difference, it rarely is a very big gender difference, and we're going to get more into that. It's not like all women are over here and all men are over there. So Janet Shibley Hyde is credited for the gender similarities hypothesis, and we're going to spend a few slides kind of talking about her work. And so one of the key points in understanding the gender similarities hypothesis is distinguishing between statistical significance versus the magnitude of difference. So statistical significance just means that we are confident that there is a difference between these groups, but it doesn't tell us how big of a deal or how big of a difference it is. So for example, if 1,000 people take a math test and the males on average get an 80 and the females on average get a 78.5, that is going to be a statistically significant difference, but we don't actually have anything telling us what the magnitude of the difference is. And so in order to do that, we have to calculate that. And Cohen's d is one common measure of effect size, or the magnitude of difference. It's the difference between two means divided by the standard deviation. And it's used to define small, like 0.2, like there on the left, or medium, 0.5, which is the second image, or large, which is like 0.8 and up, effect sizes. And so this can be used to study differences in anything, but it can be also used to study gender differences. And so what we can just take from this is there's a whole kind of curve for males and females here, two curves, right? And so there's a lot of variation between males, within males and within females, right? So some males are, whatever this is, measuring, some males are really good at it and some aren't, and some females are really good at it and some aren't. And these distributions of males and females overlap, meaning that there are some females who are better than some males, even if on average, the males are slightly better, if that makes sense, or the, females are slightly better. So hopefully this will be more clear as we go through these next few slides. Okay, so this is the first of a few slides on Janet Shibley Hyde's gender similarities hypothesis, and more specifically her meta-analysis on this. And this is from 2014, so it's already older, but it was, as far as I can tell, the last most comprehensive meta-analysis on gender differences, where she basically looked at decades of research on gender similarities and differences to determine how big these differences were. She calculated the magnitude of effect, the Cohen's d, for dozens of things. And across her meta-analysis, over 80% of the effects, over 80% of the things that she studied had no difference or what were considered small differences. So we're starting here with no difference. And so just to kind of orient you, we've got a graph there with two normal curves. So if we think about something like mathematics, we've got a curve there for women, and we've got a curve there for men, or girls and boys, or males and females. And most things, as you know, are distributed on the normal curve, meaning that there's smaller numbers of people at the tail ends. So smaller numbers of people who are really bad on math, smaller numbers of people who are really excellent on math, and most of us center around the average or the mean. That's what the normal curve means, right? So that's why there's the most number of people in the middle. And then the average is like right there at the top. So this is an example of what a no difference findings looks like. It's a Cohen's d of 0.05. And so no differences are Cohen's d between 0 and 0.10. And so this is Janet Shibley Hyde's meta-analysis found no difference for mathematics performances, at least in the United States, overall. No differences for vocabulary, reading comprehension, essay writing. No differences in reports of sadness, experiences of sadness or anger. No differences in conscientiousness. No differences in attitudes towards affairs, masturbation, oral sex or lesbians, no differences in leadership effectiveness, and no differences in academic, social, or family self-esteem. So next we move on to small gender differences. So a Cohen's d of around 0.20. And you can see the graph there for what a small gender difference might look like. The normal curves are mostly overlapping with just a slight shift in one direction. And so here's all the things that were a small gender difference. With men, or I've put in parentheses after the item who's higher. So math confidence, men slightly higher. Math anxiety, women slightly higher. Attention and effortful control, women slightly higher. Positive emotions and some negative emotions, guilt, shame, and anxiety, depression, rumination, women higher on all of those. Self-esteem for appearance, men a little tiny bit higher. Self-esteem for morality, women a little tiny bit higher. Amount of sensation seeking, tiny bit higher for men. Tentative speech, like, are you sure? That's slightly higher for women. Gregariousness, talkativeness, slightly higher for women. Slightly more positive attitudes towards gay men for women, and slightly more sexual partners for men. But again, you can get really excited about these differences, but they're tiny. And what that means when we look at these graphs are that, for example, there's a whole bunch of men who use tentative speech, that more so than a whole bunch of women who are pretty low on it. So hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of what a small gender difference might look like. Okay, so this is what a moderate or medium-sized gender difference might look like, a 0.50 Cohen's d. And so these were the things in Janet Shibley-Hyde's meta-analysis where there was a moderate gender difference. For men, it was men being higher on assertiveness, physical aggression, spatial ability, masturbation, use of porn, and attitudes towards casual sex, and for women, a higher attachment to peers. But again, when we look at these curves, we can see that there's a whole group of women, maybe a third of women are higher on assertiveness than 2/3 of men, or maybe it's more like, 40% of women are higher than, 60% of men or something like that. So we have to remember there's groups that are really define this trend, even if the average might be moderately different. Okay, here's where Janet Shibley-Hyde found larger gender differences, and these are again kind of more on psychological constructs, not just everything. And this larger gender difference was defined here as a Cohen's d of 0.80. And so the only two large gender differences that she found in her meta-analysis of psychological constructs were that women tended to be more focused on people and men tended to be more focused on things. And we do see this represented in careers, right, where women are more focused in the helping professions and men are more focused in like the STEM fields. But of course we have men and women in all fields. And women showing kind of greater tender-mindedness, which I understand as being kind of related to empathy, that women being higher than men. Again, if that's genetic or socialized, this didn't determine that. But just for a frame of reference, these are gender differences of about 0.80. Our gender differences in height are about almost twice that, a Cohen's d of 1.41. So that's a really clear, big difference. This isn't that big, right? Which means we have a lot of men who have greater empathy than women, and a lot of men who like to think about people more than they like to think about things. Okay, so one last slide here to just illustrate how gender differences are emphasized in the media. So I read this in the Sunday morning newspaper a number of years ago, and they were reporting the results from a nationwide study where they had interviewed heterosexual, I think, married couples about their satisfaction with their level of communication and verbal intimacy. And so this was the concluding statement of the article, like summing it up. And so I want you to read through this and guess, based on the language that they're using, what percentages do you think should belong in each of these two blanks? So in one area, did Parade's survey results reinforce a prevailing stereotype? Women are more likely than men to want better communication, while only blank of the husbands complained that they and their wives don't talk to each other enough. Blank of the women said they were dissatisfied with the level of intimacy. That difference, however, will probably come as a surprise to nobody. Okay, so the way you read it, you might predict like, oh, 50% of the men were dissatisfied, but 80% of the women were dissatisfied. When in fact, the numbers were 10 and 15. 10% of the husbands complained and 15% of the wives complained. And I thought it was so interesting that they were using this to tell a story of difference instead of saying something like, what may be surprising is that the majority of men and women are similarly happy with their level of verbal intimacy. 85% of women are happy and 90% of men are happy. And so I think this shows the media bias towards not only difference, but also like a problem, right? Because a problem is more interesting than not a problem. Okay, so hopefully this gives you kind of the perspective to be critically thinking about media headlines you see about difference, but especially gender differences. So let's talk about our feminist family theory empirical article example. Again, this is out of your date range, so hopefully you won't end up picking it. This was an article by Abby Goldberg there on the left and Maureen Perry Jenkins there on the right, studying the divisions of labor for lesbian couples across the transition to parenthood. In the first section of the theory paper, you simply give an overview of the study, what they were focused in on, what their hypotheses were, who they studied, what measures they used, what their results were, and the implications. These researchers were examining the division of labor during the transition to parenthood for lesbian couples who were either biological and non-biological mothers. They studied a pretty small sample, 29 lesbian couples that were vastly white and middle and upper class. They specifically measured work hours, household and childcare tasks, and parental roles. And what they found is that compared to heterosexual couples, there were relatively equal divisions of labor, but the biological mother did more childcare. However, most couples, even though the biological mother might be doing a little bit more childcare, they did not perceive her to be the primary parent. And this was kind of a question that Goldberg and Perry Jenkins had, was in lesbian couples, would biology kind of take the biology of the mother take the place of like male to female? So if male to female in heterosexual couples predicts who's going to be the primary parent, they were thinking, maybe in lesbian couples, being the biological mother would mean that you're the primary parent. But they found that that actually wasn't the case. Okay, so now you're going to summarize feminist family theory and or gender theory using this lecture and the textbook chapter. So putting it in your own words, just explaining, kind of putting the article aside and explaining like, what is feminist family therapy? What's it mean? How do you explain it to somebody? Okay, so in the third section, you just go through the research article and you look for any signs that they were using feminist family theory or gender theory, and you just summarize them here. And so this is obviously an abbreviated version, but I would point out that they clearly summarized gender theory and they talked about doing gender. They mentioned the role of cultural institutions in shaping gender roles, like we had talked about, the institutional versus individual construction of gender. They distinguished between gender roles and sex, and they said by studying lesbians, we're going to try to tease out what gender roles look like when sex is held constant, as all subjects in the study were female. They focused on divisions of labor, which is a common part of feminist family theory, and that assumption that equality is desired. Feminism is emancipatory. They were focusing in on that as well. Now, I had to infer some of this. They weren't always saying it exactly like I said it in the lecture or I read it in the book. So I'm kind of looking for clues that match up to the way that we've talked about it. So now I go back and say, okay, putting on my thinking cap, what do I think they did well? What could they have done better? And I'm going to say, yep, they clearly describe gender theory and the social construction of gendered roles. They distinguish between sex and gender. They chose measures for sex roles and gender roles. They had multiple measures for the divisions of labor, but one thing that they could have done better was tying in the separate spheres ideology. They didn't mention that at all, and that seems pretty relevant here in thinking about how lesbian couples might be dividing paid and unpaid labor according to that kind of ingrained separate spheres ideology. Okay, so in the fifth and final section, I pick one of these other 5 theories we've been talking about in this unit, and I apply it to this study. And so I say, okay, they didn't use family development or life course perspective, but what if I looked at this topic or study from that perspective? And so I would explain briefly what family life course development theory was. I might talk about stage, task, transition, social context. And then I would say if researchers were using life course, for example, to hypothesize about these lesbian couples during the transition to parenthood, they might hypothesize that they have a unique social context, being lesbians, that influences this task that they have during this transition to parenthood, which is kind of both a transition and a stage, early raising of kids. One of their tasks is to divide up labor. And so it's important to remember task doesn't mean the labor. It means like that they are figuring out how to divide up labor. And I'm going to suggest that, yeah, maybe they already have kind of an awareness of gendered roles and equality that benefit them, right? And so maybe the social context, when I think about the results, the social context of lesbian couples encourages more equality during the transition to parenthood. Hey, you made it to the end. Good job.